Why do richer nations consume so much? Many sociologists argue that capitalism promotes consumerism, especially in wealthier nations. The goal of capitalist companies is to maximize profits by increasing sales. There are multiple ways to do this. One way is through planned obsolescence. The earliest instance of planned obsolescence is often thought to be from the 1920s, when a cartel of the world's leading light bulb manufacturers, including GE from the US, met and discussed developing light bulb technology so that incandescent light bulbs would burn for only 1,000 hours, which was about half the time that bulbs of that era were lasting. The idea was that if light bulbs don't last as long, consumers will need to buy more bulbs more often. This would increase profits for light bulb companies, but also increase waste production because individuals would be discarding burned out bulbs at a faster rate. Planned obsolescence is not limited to the light bulb industry. Though cellular phones have changed rapidly in the past 2 decades, they change very little from year to year. Yet individuals rarely use their cellular phones until the phone no longer functions. Because phone developers market new phone models every year in order to keep profits flowing, consumers often buy new phones and discard perfectly working ones. According to 2010 data, the average replacement time for cell phones in the US is 21.7 months, or less than 2 years. In less wealthy nations, like Brazil and India, replacement by cell phone users is less frequent. Also, a much smaller proportion of the population owns cell phones. This regular consumption of new cell phones also produces a huge amount of electronic waste. In much of the modern industrial world, consumerism is part of everyday culture. In the US especially, the acquisition of material goods is highly valued as a status symbol. Consumption of material goods is considered a reflection of personal success. Also, individuality is very important in our culture, and most Americans believe that products allow us to express our unique identity. This brings us to another way that companies try to maximize profits, through marketing. The advertising industry is tasked with the objective of creating needs for consumers. If consumers feel that they need certain products, they will feel justified in buying them. Often, advertising focuses on the status that comes with buying a certain product. Children make especially good consumers and targets of advertising. The average American child watches approximately 25,000 to 40,000 television commercials per year. Research has shown that children under 12 and teens influence parental purchases totaling over $130 to $670 billion a year. Critics of capitalism and consumerism argue that they encourage consumption that surpasses human need. Consumption requires extraction of resources from the environment and the production of pollution and waste, all of which often damages the environment. Certainly humans must consume to survive, but wealthier nations seem to be consuming at rates well above and beyond those needed for survival, compounding environmental damage. In the last century, individuals have become more aware of the impact that consumption has on the environment, and the destruction of the environment has come to be viewed as a social problem. There have been 3 types of responses to environmental problems. Individual solutions to environmental problems include some of the following. Choosing to ride public transportation reduces air pollution. Cutting back on consumption reduces the amount of solid waste that's generated, like cell phones. Recycling and composting also reduces solid waste. Finally, supporting environmentally responsible businesses and boycotting those known to be big polluters affects the bottom line and ultimately the behavior of corporations. There has also been an implementation of societal solutions in addressing environmental problems. This includes efforts to promote sustainable development environmental justice organizations, and federal regulations. Examples of federal regulations with the goal of environmental protection are fuel standards for cars, which have increasingly emphasized better gas mileage, as well as financial incentives for environmentally responsible business behavior by corporations, subsidies for green energy, etc. Another response to environmental problems is environmental activism. Environmental activists focus on bringing attention to the environment as a social problem via protests and lobbying. These actors can be considered claims makers. They typically advocate both individual and societal responses for environmental protection. These images show activists protesting a local environmental issue. Tanker trains carrying oil from North Dakota, Montana, and Canada travel through Albany, New York on their way to refineries on the East Coast. In light of recent explosions of derailed oil cars in Canada and the U.S., activists claim that the citizens of Albany, New York are taking on risk for no reward. Albany residents do not share in the oil profits. Because of their efforts, Governor Andrew Cuomo of New York has been pushing for federal action to strengthen national regulation of crude oil transport. Internationally, environmental activists have long been trying to frame climate change as a social problem. They argue that increased carbon emission leads to significant changes in climate patterns of the Earth. This phenomenon has also been called global warming because the Earth's average temperature has risen steadily for the past few centuries, since the boom in carbon emissions brought by the Industrial Revolution. See the graph from earlier. Causing the polar ice caps to steadily melt, the ocean level to steadily rise. There's relative consensus among scientists that climate change is associated with human activity, especially increases in carbon monoxide and other greenhouse gas emissions. This chart demonstrates that most studies surveying scientists find that they tend to believe global warming is being caused by human activities, such as pollution. Yet Gallup polls recently showed that only 39% of Americans believe that global warming is a problem caused by humans, and therefore something we can solve, while 25% are confident that it is not a problem at all. Some media outlets are even claiming that climate change is the most polarizing topic in the U.S., beating out abortion. How is this possible? Similar to the ways in which environmental activists have been making claims about the problems with climate change, other groups, such as the American Legislative Exchange Council, a lobbyist for the fossil fuel industry, have been helping to generate counterclaims. ALEC and the American Petroleum Institute, API, for example, have been lobbying politicians to fight climate change legislation, funding researchers to find evidence that contradicts the effects of carbon emissions on climate change, and sponsoring advertising campaigns to convince the general public that climate change is not a social problem. Your reading for this week, Selling Environmental Problems, discussed how some environmental issues generate public and political support.